was every month, every second Tuesday. But I appreciate you being here. We're are talking about a place that we all know as Lakeshore Park. But before that, it was for many years, for 130 years or so, was a mental hospital. In fact, the first mental hospital in East Tennessee. It was founded just after the Civil War, and as you might imagine, there were reasons for that. There were a lot of men who came home from the war on both sides who weren't quite the same people as they had been in one of the war. Some of them had came back with what we would call post-traumatic stress disorder. They called it something else back then. But also they some of them came back with head injuries, and this was a sudden kind of urgent need for mental health hospital in Tennessee. We had one already in the Nashville area, but this was the second one ever in Tennessee history. It was established here first in 1873. And it seemed like a done deal. It was going to happen, and then it didn't. And they said it was politics behind all that. In fact, Civil War politics perhaps was in the 1870s was comparable to today in some ways. But that faded, and then it came back again. It was proposed by Marcus Lafayette Bearden in 1883, a guy who had already been sheriff of Knox County and mayor of Knoxville, partly at the same time, which is hard to imagine. But he was in the state legislature in the 1880s. Union veteran, was a much admired fellow here. Captain Bearden was proposed that we go ahead and finish this mental hospital and get this done. And they began building it with bricks from around from brick suppliers, including a guy named Grundy Crump, who was a formerly enslaved person who lived here at the time, helped them build the hospital. But this was a very important and kind of a model institution in those days. Dorothea Dix, the very famous reformer in Massachusetts, knew about this and was actually pushing for it. She was an old lady at this time. She was already famous for kind of the first kind of great proponent of mental health hospitals in America. And she heard about the problems in Tennessee, and she said, "You all need to finish this hospital in Knoxville as soon as you can." So she was watching this carefully, and was interested to see what happened, and was glad to see this finally happen in 1883. By the way, Marcus Lafayette Bearden was, I mentioned a lot of these men came back from the war with wounds that didn't heal. That's right. And Marcus Lafayette Bearden himself, even though he had been mayor and sheriff, had an injury to his leg, not to his head, but to his leg, that was never healed. They say that when he died in his 50s in 1885, it was a result of a war injury, 20 years after the war. But he died, and that was when they started calling Bearden, and called other things before that. But the assumption is that they called Bearden because they were grateful for this big employer, the mental hospital in Bearden, this big permanent thing that was there. But the mental hospital was not just a hospital. It was actually a self-sustaining town in a way. They had a farm, they had a power plant, they had a lot of things that even a small town has that can self-sustain without even connections to Knoxville. There were places when people started moving out to Lyons View, they found they didn't have electricity or a water system or a sewer system, but Lyons View did. Lyons View Mental Health Hospital did. They called it various things up here. So it's the Eastern branch mental hospital at one time, Eastern State at one time. It was called, but we usually called it Lyons View Asylum in those early days. And of course, asylum didn't mean anything bad. Asylum literally means a safe place. And that's what they meant by this. a safe place for people with mental problems. But this was it was a beautiful place, a beautiful campus by the river, and they talked about even then, this was one of the most beautiful spots in Knoxville County, they said. And it says something about them that they chose to devote this to mental health. This was it was actually a campus bigger than the University of Tennessee at the time. This UT was just up on its hill. This was this big campus that had farming, it had gardens, it had lots of buildings for various purposes in the operation of the facility. But it was there. It's amazing that it was there kind of by itself. It didn't really even need Knoxville. It was there by itself, and people came from the train station at Bearden back and forth to there without going down Lions View. It was their main connection to the rest of the world was the Bearden train station, which was over here, not far from there. But it has a fascinating history, though, and I think it's a history that is still unfolding. We have had changes in the way we think about the mentally ill in recent decades, and whether it's good or bad is not for me to say. But it's something. This public hospital is something we don't have anymore in East Tennessee. But it's all this time. People lived there and died there, and who died there didn't always have family who were willing to come to Knoxville, pick them up, and take them home and bury them somewhere else. And this, we're grateful to Olivia Roberts to have done this research. When Paul and I wrote the history of Bearden a few years ago, we were curious about this. We heard that there were records that we could not get to at the time about the graveyard, and this was very interesting to me to learn more about it. But we didn't learn more about it. We walked around the graveyard, took some pictures, but didn't know that much about it. But I'm grateful that a young woman, Olivia Roberts, is just graduating this month from the University of Tennessee. She's been in the Appalachian Studies program there, and as part of her main project for graduating, her thesis has been looking into the history of Eastern State and its cemetery that's still there today. But without further ado from me, I will pass the baton to Olivia Roberts.
Hi guys, I'm more than happy to be here. Doing this project was really interesting to learn about how Knoxville used to function and how we kind of celebrate it today and what we choose to remember and what we don't choose to remember. So, like Jack said, I'm a student at the University of Tennessee. I'm graduating on Sunday, and I'm really excited. But I'm from Knoxville originally. I was born and raised here. I grew up pretty close to the area of Lakeshore Park, and so I remember going when I was younger, around the time that it was being demolished, and always being kind of curious about what it used to be. But then I ended up attending West High School, graduating from the university. I am an interdisciplinary Appalachian Studies major through the College Scholars Program on campus, which is an honors program that allows students to build a major that's not offered by the university. And I've done some interning at the Historical Society at the Beck Cultural Center, taken a bunch of different classes, and just have really come to love public history, and especially looking into kind of forgotten stories, you could say. So to kind of get into the nitty-gritty for this project that I wanted to do for College Scholars, I realized that I had never seen a cemetery for the patients that were buried at the asylum. And I realized people had to have died there. I mean, they just did. And so where did they go was my next question. And so when I learned that it was behind the Veterans Cemetery, after that I was kind of hooked. I think it just feels a little bit tucked away in a sense. And I just really wanted to highlight the stories that are involved with that place. So history of the cemetery. It contains hundreds, maybe thousands of graves. Nobody is exactly sure. I've seen numbers that say 200. I've seen numbers that say 2,000. I can't exactly confirm how many there are, but I have been able to identify 700. And so there was very little markers involved in the cemetery. If you did have a marker, it would be a numbered plaque. It would be a little square and it would have a number on it. And in theory, that would correspond to your burial record, but the records of the burials themselves are also kind of wishy-washy, so it's really hard to know. There are a few headstones that are original to the burials at the time that do have names on them. Clearly, somebody's family had maybe some means and was able to get it over there. And then there's also some newer headstones as well that have recently been placed by descendants of family members. So that's a great thing that is able to be done sometimes when working with the veteran cemetery, is some families are able to go back in and get a headstone for their deceased loved ones. But this site is often kind of forgotten about. Not many people know it exists, and it serves as a reminder of who we choose to remember and who we choose to forget. So I wanted to kind of include some clips from newspaper articles and some pictures that I've taken as well. So this bottom one explores the cemetery. You can kind of see those little tiny stones poking out of the ground. Those would be the ones that would be numbered. And then there's also some pictures I wanted to include about kind of the founding, you could say. So originally, the first year that the asylum opened in 1886, they were burying patients right there, like on the hill near the administration building. And then they realized that that was not going to work and that they were going to have to do something different. And so they ended up moving over to the land across the street, and they reinterred the bodies that had been buried in the new plot of land. And so ever since 1887 is when that cemetery has fully started. And then in this second article that's titled Tombstones was from 1910. So they didn't get official numbered markers until 1910. So any burial prior to then would have had a wooden cross marker. That's discussed in this article, but nobody really knows for sure, of course. And then, okay, this is about cemetery. Here's some more cemetery pictures. The patients were buried really quickly, and this was a kind of a common practice. It was often done during the nighttime, so people in the community didn't have to see the burials. There might have been a discussion with a reverend who might come and bless the body, but really typically it was just the undertakers of the facility, and then maybe a couple nurses would come, but it was often poorly documented and not really well kept. Occasionally the bodies were shipped, especially in the 60s, over to Memphis, and they were used as research for science. And so there's a lot of hardships in identifying who is where and how many and all the different things of that nature, just because the records weren't properly kept and they changed over time. And this kind of surrounds the idea of how mental health was stigmatized, especially back in the day, and still continues to be as well. So here's just a couple more pictures. This is one headstone that is original to the cemetery, and I think that this one kind of speaks words, because you can see at the bottom, it might be kind of hard to see on this screen, but it says carried to the hospital in 1886, and I think that that's just a really important reminder. And then we also have a couple other stories about the burials themselves. This is one I was talking about with the customs. As it says, the burial is custom to be done after dark. And then the other one is a case where a father had to send his son to the asylum for, I think it was epilepsy, and the son ended up dying, and the father was not notified. And the father ended up suing the hospital because he was not notified, so he was unable to claim his son's body, and his son had been buried in the asylum cemetery. So there's a lot of things like that, of that nature as well, that occurred. And then, oh yeah, okay. I'm going to switch off of this and show some patient stories now, because that's kind of the main faction of my research. I made this website, which will be shared with everyone, and that kind of also covers the history and the history of the cemetery as well. But the big chunk of what I did here is this list of patients. So like I mentioned, I was able to find 700 patient names. I found those through going through Tennessee death records, and it was identified that they were buried there. So I put them all on this website. So for each 700 names, you're able to click on the name, and it will take you to their page. And I have researched each of their lives, and there's a little blurb about their life and their experience. Because I think it's really important to show that these were people outside of institutionalization. They weren't just patients at an asylum who died. They were real life people who had real life experiences, and all of their identities were different. So I wanted to, I have a couple pulled up that I find to be particularly interesting in exploring how many different identities there were at the asylum. This one is Frankie. She was the daughter of a recently freed Black couple that had been freed from slavery, and they went to the Freedmen's Normal Institute in Blount County, which was a school teaching recently freed slaves. And so she grew up in a really educated household. She learned a lot and was very involved with her community and her church life. And then she ended up having what was described as a mental deficiency and was taken to the hospital and passed. So that's another thing. I don't necessarily always know what mental deficiency could be so many things. And that's another challenge of this research is I try to identify what their experience might have been like, but then when you're looking at documents like this, it's hard to say for sure what her day-to-day would have looked like, you know? And this is another one. This one I find really fascinating. Her name is Cornelia. She grew up in Knox County, and she was a teacher. And she was a really good teacher. She was an educated young woman. She ended up teaching at the schoolhouse in Knox County that she attended. And then she just moved her way up from there. She went to work for lots of different Knox County schools. She ended up becoming a principal for a Knox County school and was really just an advocate for education. She ended up moving to the coal camps in West Virginia and taught children how to read that were living in the coal camps, and just had a lot of involvement within her community and did a lot of great things to try to care for children. But she never married or had any children of her own. So she ended up having some issues with dementia when she got older. She had no one to care for her, and so she was put in the asylum where she passed. And so stories like these show us, you know, how different people's experiences were. This next one is a little bit more of maybe your traditional, stereotypical asylum story, you could say, but even then, it still isn't. This is Dallas. He lived in Crossville, but not just Crossville. He lived across America. This was a con man. He loved to forge checks. And he was really good at it. He made claims that he was a war hero who had gone to all these different places and fought. He was supposedly a captain of the Salvation Army. He was a preacher, and he traveled and preached to people, but all of it was just forgery. It was never anything legit. He ended up going missing because he left his wife. He went missing. He had a bunch of different aliases. I mean, this guy, like, he was doing it. He was doing the illegal thing. Wife says husband has forgery mania. Like, you know, that's so intriguing. But he ended up getting away with almost all of his crimes. He was in and out of jail here and there, but he ended up settling down in Crossville and just lived out the rest of his days. And then he had a little bit of issues with some dementia, and that's how he was put into the asylum, and he passed. Oh. And let's see, this next one is Alonzo. Alonzo was from Chattanooga, and he is by far, I think, the oldest resident that had lived at the asylum. He had lived there a really long time. He died when he was 97, and he was institutionalized in his early 20s. And so he was there a really long time, and he was institutionalized because his family owned a grocery store in downtown Chattanooga, and for some reason, he ended up setting the grocery store on fire. I'm not sure if there was maybe some family trauma, or if there was actually some mental health stuff, or what. But because he set the building on fire, the bigger issue was that the grocery store was next to a broom-making factory, and so then the whole block went in flames, and so then he was arrested and in turn institutionalized. And he lived there his whole life. He supposedly had no known relatives, and this newspaper article claims that he loves to say that he's reading the news, but he never learned how to read. I know. This is another one that I found really interesting I hadn't heard of. This was a young boy who was institutionalized at the Pikeville Home for Colored Boys, which I hadn't heard about. It was an industrial type of school, and it was for boys who had committed, criminal offenses. A lot of these were just young African-American men making mistakes, but to greater society, this meant shipping off. And so Lonnie was shipped off really young, and he ended up struggling with likely some abuse from this system. Based on what I've read about the Pikeville Home for Colored Boys, it was really challenging. They made you do a lot of manual labor. The conditions were very unsanitary, and there was a lot of abuse from the staff. So Lonnie ended up being transferred from there to the asylum because of manic depressive and insanity, and he died only at 16. And then this is kind of the last one I just wanted to touch on. This was Mary Henderson. She had some amnesia, but when I ended up digging about her life more, it was discovered that her and her husband actually sold drugs, and they were using the drugs as well. And so it's likely that she was actually in some kind of drug-induced state that a lot of people at the time wouldn't have known about. And so she ended up just being stuck there. Nobody ever found her. So yeah, that kind of covers all the different patient stories. I just wanted to explore that so I could show you guys that there's so many different forms of identity within these patients, and that the story was not singular. A lot of times we have an idea of what an asylum patient looks like or how they're maybe supposed to act, and that just wasn't the case. The Lakeshore Asylum held young men and women that had epilepsy. It held old men and women that had dementia. It held people with tuberculosis. It had a tuberculosis ward. So it wasn't just, oh, you're insane. There was a lot of different reasons why you could have been institutionalized. And so that's why I wanted to make a website, is to present this research in a way that's accessible to others, and kind of focuses on an interactive and engaging source of public history. And I did this also because of the challenges when it comes to trying to research this topic. I wasn't able to find hardly any information myself, but luckily for me, I was able to go sit in an archive and dig around for hours. But a lot of people are not able to do that. So I wanted to have this website to be accessible to families, curious community members, descendants, etc., that are looking to learn more. I guess I put my slides in the wrong order, but here's more patient stories. Here's more about just some, ideas of why it matters to learn about them. And these are some pictures of patients that were institutionalized there. And the importance to me of this project is the memorialization aspect, as probably it is gathered. This is a picture that I was describing with the markers in the cemetery. So that's what it would have looked like. And it highlights just how easily people can be forgotten, and how memorialization serves as a way to acknowledge historical injustices, and it allows us to reflect on our community in ways that we can further celebrate it, and remember it, and raises some ethical questions. So, all in all, this is relevant to Knoxville because it reflects mental health stigma and holds us historically accountable, but also many people are unaware of Lakeshore Park's history, and that's simply just what I wanted to spread was that, you know, it's a beautiful park and it's a great site to go, and I suggest everybody goes, but I think it's easy for history to be forgotten when it's replaced by something else. So that's really the main goal and takeaway of this project. But I would love any questions, and I would love for people to have access to this website so they can go and explore it further as well. That's all I got.
How many hours do you have in this?
He asked me how many hours I have in this. This took me 2 years, and I told people in my lives that would ask me how much time it took me, and I would say for each person I did, it took about an hour. So an hour per name. So, and there's 700 names. I didn't sleep a lot for 2 years, I will say, but I got it done on time. Yes, sir.
How did the Veterans Cemetery work with the existing hospital cemetery?
Yeah, absolutely. So the hospital cemetery stopped burials in the mid-1960s. So after that, there were no more burials in that cemetery. So the rest of that land was completely open. And it was still owned by the Tennessee state government because the asylum was owned by the Tennessee state government. And so as the asylum was kind of beginning to shut down and change hands, in the 90s, they were looking for land in Knoxville to build a veteran cemetery, or to have a veteran cemetery, and since that land was already owned by the Tennessee state government, it was just an easy route to go ahead and take it. So that's why they put it there.
Follow up. Are there any soldiers buried in the Asylum cemetery?
Yes, there are. There's a few that I found. Some of them Civil War, some of them World War I, some of them World War II. But the majority that I've seen were World War I, and there's only 2 headstones that I know of for the veterans that are buried as part of the Asylum cemetery. One of them does have a stone that looks similar to the other veteran stones, but that's all.
Okay.
Yeah, in the back.
I know that it was demolished in 2012. What was the last year that there were actually residents there?
I would probably say 2011. 2011, 2012. It existed for a really long time. There were a lot of different formats it took on, especially in the 2010s. It was also like an adolescent facility and also a rehab facility as well. So it wasn't just for mental health at that point anymore. But the state had cut funding down so much that there was just less and less patients because there was less and less staff. And so when they ended up shutting down, unfortunately, the government of Knoxville did do what was called just like, I guess, patient dumping is what it's called, where a lot of patients were just either kind of put into jails or put on the street because there was no more public institution. It was all private in Knoxville. Yes, you sir.
Were you ever able to discover code from the numbered grave sites to the names?
He asked me about the codes with the numbered markers. I have not been able to find out a code at all. Of course, there's a lot that are missing, so the pattern just kind of cuts off, but I can't seem to figure. I think it's semi-based on year and semi-based on race, but I am just not 100% at all. They reused a lot of the same numbers, so it's not like, oh, it goes from 1 to 700. It's like the number 63 will appear 4 times. So it's just really challenging to find the system.
Did you primarily paper files, or has it been digitized, or how does it work for you to go through it?
Yeah, it's been a mix of both. For me to do the actual research, it was paper. It was in the archive at the Historical Society for the most part. The newspapers was great because they have the newspapers.com database, which was really good for me because I could use that to look up patient names and stuff. But really, where I did a lot of the research for the death certificates in particular was at the archives. But then a lot of my work was to digitize it.
I see.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you have any idea if the father who had the epileptic son that was buried in the graveyard in the cemetery, did he win his complaint?
I don't think he did. There was another case that I had heard about where somebody's mother had done something similar, where she wasn't informed about a burial and had sued them, and she did win that case. And that was in the 30s, I believe. This one was a little bit previous to that. So I think it was something that could have been done, but I don't think it was all the time.
Is the cemetery open to the public?
Yes, the cemetery is absolutely open to the public. You just go up into the Veterans Cemetery, you go up, there's a little cul-de-sac, park the car, and there's a little tiny sign, and you just... Yes.
Okay, so you're saying even though you know the names, you have no idea exactly where they're buried.
Correct. There's a limited information on where they were actually buried. The records that I was able to come in contact with did not specify where exactly in the ground they are. Now, I've heard rumors that might exist out there somewhere. I've heard there's some secret book being held in Nashville that I don't nobody got to show me. That would have been helpful. So there might be a true plot map out there somewhere, but based on everything I found, it's all kind of just wish-washed together.
Were you able to find any descendants of these patients?
Yes, so that's another important part about my website is I have a contact page. So people can contact me if they have questions about somebody in particular, or if they are looking for someone, want to add something, want to take something away. I'm here for it. Whatever the people want is what I will do. But yes, I have had families reach out to me. The Lakeshore Conservancy group, they are the ones that kind of take care of that Parks and Rec Center. They connected me with a woman who was looking for information on her great-grandmother, and I was able to do kind of a full write-up for her about her life. Of course, I wasn't able to tell her where exactly the spot she was buried in was, but I was able to show her that she definitely was in that asylum cemetery and kind of explain, based on what I've done as a researcher, explain kind of what her life may have looked like as an institutionalized patient.
That's really wonderful that you could do that. I assume you encourage people to look into the evidence before making a request.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, if you have something off the top of your head, you're more than welcome to, but I think looking at the website beforehand is helpful. There's a search bar, so if you're thinking about something in particular, you have an option to look up and see if it's already there or not.
I've got another question. You know, sometimes families of people that work there lived on campus. Is there any evidence any of those family members were buried in that cemetery?
I haven't seen any evidence that the families that worked there / lived there were buried in that cemetery. A lot of the employees that worked at the segregated portion of the asylum, who were also people of color, lived in that local Lions View Homburg area community, and they're buried at that little small Lions View church right there, but none in the actual asylum's cemetery itself. Same for all the other, supervisors, patrons, whatever you want to call them. They were not buried there. There was a couple women that gave birth in the asylum while institutionalized, and a lot of times their babies would pass as infants because it's an insane asylum and it's very unsanitary and not a great place to have an infant thrive. So a lot of times the infants would be buried in that asylum hospital or cemetery as well.
If you or someone else could do another 2 years of research, what would you want the sequel to your project to look like? What would the topic be?
It's a really good question. I would say the sequel for me after doing this would probably be a focus on specifically how the media at the time talked about these patients. I've looking through all their names and researching all their identities, I always tried to find newspaper articles, and a lot of times I did. And the way that they were described in the newspapers with this vivid imagination is really intriguing to me and something that I would be interested in looking at further.
I think I remember where the vineyard was up on the hill because it was in disarray, but I saw it there. I was wondering, well, one, if they were growing grapes, were they also making wine? And when's the party start? I wonder what else they grew, where they grew it, and was it, somewhat self-sufficient? Were they using what they grew?
Yeah, so like Jack was explaining, they were essentially a tiny community. I mean, they really did support themselves in a lot of ways. So not every patient was able to work in the gardens or on the farms, but a lot of them were. So the ones that were able to did, and there's a few different crops from what I've understood, but all the stuff that they grew, they did consume. And then whatever was left over, they sold down at Market House. And they did have grapes, and I have heard that they did make wine. I don't want to say that with 1,000% confidence and tell you that there's a bottle out there you can find somewhere. But I have heard a rumor that they did in fact make wine. But yes, they grew all their stuff. They even had a dairy house at one point too, not on the Lions View property. I believe that was on the other side of the hill, the other side of the river, that they had a little dairy farm on as well.
They also had a boat because they would have to go to the island that's out in the water and retrieve some of their guests.
Did you
So
repeat
they had
that?
a little John boat or some kind of little.
Yes, this gentleman up front says that apparently they also had a boat because there's an island in the river, and so sometimes they would have to transport back and forth.
How long they continued farming, and about when that was discontinued?
I think really the 40s, 30s, 40s, around the time of the Great Depression is when a lot of that farming kind of stopped or dwindled, you would say. Because by the time that they stopped burying people in the cemetery, they had been farming for quite some time. Yes, sir.
As a member of a sitting club at UT in the late 60s, I was 10 at the time, but we went out and interacted with children in a place there. So there was no appropriate place. Do you know what happened after that cemetery was not used? Anyone who died on campus where they were?
Yeah, so anybody else who died after the cemetery was no longer accepting burials, was buried either by that Rose Home mortuary group, and I'm not exactly sure which cemetery they would have been buried in after that. At this point, a lot of the bodies were claimed. Almost all of them were able to be claimed by their families, and if you were unclaimed, you were often sent to medical schools. There was one in Memphis where a lot of unclaimed bodies went and were done for science research.
I was a nurse in Naperville.
Okay.
73 to 76. And I had a group of people who had been there over 20 years. And they often talked about the cemetery. We actually took those folks to make it across the street. We had a guardhouse. And the guard elephants stood up there and around, and they talked a lot about it. Did they know where their friends were? No, but there was one man who was and he had held a burial, probably in the 60s. But they had quite a lot of stories.
Yeah, the segregated building was called the Underhill Building.
But that was quite a lot of, and then with the way Asylum was in started together, let them all out, and they all came down to the wire. Downtown area.
I'm not sure about that. I know that there was a raid in the 70s, the 1971 midnight raid on the asylum, which was done by Richard Craig.
State representative. He was a state representative.
Any more questions?
Thank you for your.
What is your
Thanks very much, Olivia. I suspect we'll have you again on a completely different subject someday. I don't know how many people know, this may be one of the most literary mental institutions in America, because it's been referred to, there have been scenes in the novel In the Tennessee Country by Peter Taylor, Pulitzer Prize winning novelist, but also in at least two Cormac McCarthy novels. There are scenes at this institution, as well as Tennessee Williams referred to the Lions View Asylum, even though it's set in Louisiana. He knew about the Lions View Asylum because his family lived here, and some of them were associated with it in different ways. But that's it's interesting to track all those things down. You could actually make a small book out of all the references to this in literature. But it's a fascinating place, and it's also interesting to us right now because we not only looked into this when we did Historic Period, but I think we have some copies of Historic Period. If you have it here, it has a page or two about the asylum. I call it asylum. They use it in a non-judgmental way a long time ago. I think in the 1920s, people said asylum's a bad word. It was changed to the name of Asylum Avenue and all this, but it just means a safe place. That's what an asylum means. But we have we have the Bearden book, but we're also working on the Eugenia Williams series. And next month we're going to be talking at Eugenia Williams about her neighborhood. And of course, the asylum was part of the neighborhood, and maybe the reason that her father bought property there. Her father was a doctor who came here to teach medicine at the old Tennessee Medical School that was here. And they were so proud of this campus in the 1880s that they would have statewide medical conferences at the asylum. And I think the first time Dr. David Williams from Bellevue Hospital Medical School in New York came here was to go to the asylum, one of these medical conferences at the asylum. And I looked around and said, gosh, there's a pretty place, but this property is available for sale, you can buy it. And that's where his daughter, much later, built the house he knows, the Gene Williams house. But anyway, but thanks for coming out. We're going to be here next month on the second Tuesday. It is very close to the Statehood Day in Tennessee, which is June 1st, and it celebrates something that happened in Philadelphia when President Washington signed Tennessee into becoming a state. But what made that happen is what we're going to be talking about here. What made that happen happened here in Knoxville a few weeks and months before that, with the state convention, the Constitutional Convention that was here, and a lot of very interesting people, including very young Andrew Jackson, were here, and William Charles Hope Faber and James Robertson from Nashville, and other people were here, arguing about in terms of religion, religious freedom, and